And you're positive I can't just do jail time? Before we start, there's some stuff I gotta get off my chest. If you're new to the channel, you can just skip ahead to this timestamp. But if you're a returning viewer, then you either know me from my Hungry Burger video, or from this thing that I made. I'm gonna be honest, my feelings towards this video are rather mixed. On the one hand, I had a lot of fun editing it, and it was a really good learning opportunity. My arguments received a lot of well-deserved criticism, and ultimately my views towards the legality of Pot of Greed have changed. But on the other hand, I also spent an entire month essentially being an online punching bag, to the point where it physically hurts to look at my comment section. That being said, I do genuinely appreciate the feedback that I received. I don't think I could have grown as much as I had in the last few months had I not gotten this sort of backlash. The experience was incredibly eye-opening, and I feel like I've learned a lot as a result of putting myself out there the way that I did. I've taken a lot of the criticism to heart, and I've been focusing lately on trying to improve my writing and argumentation. So for those of you who did provide something of value in your comments, seriously, thank you. The reason I'm even bringing this up, though, is because for months I've been actively avoiding making another Yu-Gi-Oh essay. At the time, I felt like it was necessary to take a break and focus on other projects in order to work on my writing. And for the last few months, that's what I've been doing. At the time of recording, I'm in the middle of editing an hour-long essay over the stage Wet Dry World from Mario 64, and I'm really excited to share that when it's done. But the truth is that I never wanted to go on this break to begin with. I love this game, and regardless of its flaws or whatever controversial opinions I may express in the future, I'm not going to stop loving this game. I just want to be able to talk about the things I enjoy on this channel, and Yu-Gi-Oh happens to be one of those things. So it genuinely bothers me that I've been abstaining from doing so. If that means I'm sometimes going to have bad takes, then that's something I'm willing to live with. But in all honesty, what finally forced me to end my abstinence was this fucking travesty. In January this year, Konami released a $20 two-player starter deck. The product is designed to run a pair of people through a scripted duel and give them a controlled environment where they can be introduced to all the modern mechanics. In particular, the product places a major focus on the Synchro NXC summoning mechanics. When this was first announced, I was honestly a bit excited since I've been trying to get my siblings into Yu-Gi-Oh for a while now. I thought we were basically getting a Vanadium starter deck along with some other Xyz archetype. I assumed it would run players through the basics of archetype-driven deck design, and would handhold players through the mechanics that have become important in the modern game, like chain links and hand traps. What we got instead was abysmal. YugiTuber Paul from Team APS already has an excellent review for the product where he brought in two newcomers and had them go in blind, and I highly recommend that you check it out for proper context. Not only does this product fail to introduce players to relevant modern-day mechanics, but it even fails to teach rudimentary stuff like where to summon a monster or how to perform a flip effect during battle. It's overall a very shoddy product, and you're better off saving your money unless you really need a copy of Zeus and don't want to wait on an online order. I'd also be remiss not to mention Breadboy Weave's video addressing this product. He does an incredible job of laying out its issues in a very brief and concise manner, and his solution for fixing this starter deck is pretty much in line with what I would have suggested. You should definitely give it a watch. So this got me thinking, where did this product go wrong? How have we gotten to the point where not even a duel in a controlled environment can provide a guaranteed method to teach players how to learn the game? It's sort of a meme at this point that Yu-Gi-Oh players pretty much have to be brought into the game through a friend, like they're being indoctrinated into a cult. And personally, I find that unacceptable. Surely it's possible to create a standalone tutorial that can properly onboard new players. And I think the only reason it hasn't been done yet is because Konami at this point genuinely doesn't know how. So, I've taken it upon myself to succeed where Konami has failed. This video is designed to serve as a tutorial for new players looking to get into the game. I did speak with a few friends this time to ensure some quality control, but aside from some corrections and clarifications, this is more or less my own words, knowledge, and thought processes. By the end of this video, I promise that you'll walk away with the necessary fundamentals needed to begin your journey as a Yu-Gi-Oh player, regardless of whether you're just wanting to play this game with friends, or if you're wanting to take your first competitive deck to locals. And once that's done, we'll reflect on what we've discussed and get to the bottom of why this game can be hard for people to learn. We'll start first with a crash course of the game's mechanics, and once that's done, we'll move on to other topics that may be relevant to the modern game. Despite how long this section is in the video timeline, you're just going to have to take my word that this is the short version. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, both players construct a main deck of 40 to 60 cards, along with an optional extra deck that can have up to 15 cards. In a tournament setting, you're also allowed a side deck of 15 cards. You can only have up to 3 copies of a card in your deck. Each player starts with 8,000 life points and draws 5 cards, and there are no mulligans. The first player doesn't draw until their next turn, and the second player gets the first opportunity to draw a card and to do battle. Both players play the game until someone dies or runs out of cards. If there's a time limit, the player with the most life points wins when the time runs out. You have 6 phases during a turn. There's the draw phase, the standby phase, the first main phase, the battle phase, the second main phase, and the end phase. Some cards can only be activated during a specific phase, whereas others can be activated at any point during a turn. The battle phase also has its own series of steps, and during those points, certain cards and effects can also be activated. This means that certain cards have specific timing for when their effects can go off during the battle phase, and you can't activate effects during the damage step unless your card says that they can. Whenever you take an action in Yu-Gi-Oh!, this starts something called a chain. This is most comparable to the stack in Magic the Gathering, but in Yu-Gi-Oh!, a card or effect can only respond to the most recent action on the chain. You can view this video here for a full breakdown, but what this means is that in some instances, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has true combos akin to a fighting game. Preventing your opponent from responding to an earlier card or effect on the chain is known as chain blocking. In Yu-Gi-Oh! You can only respond to a previous card on a chain with a card of an equal or greater spell speed. Spell speed is basically a priority system in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it has 3 tiers with spell speed 3 being the highest. Finally, a lot of cards have once per turn stipulations with their effects. Some of them apply only to a single instance of a card, while others are hard once per turns and apply to all of your copies of that card. This restriction mostly exists to stop a bunch of insane combos, since Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have a resource system. And with all that laid out, we can finally start talking about the different cards. There are 3 types of cards: monsters, spells, and traps. There are different variations of these 3 types, but generally speaking, these ones don't come up that often. We'll return to the relevant ones later, and you're free to research the rest in your own time. The space where you play your cards is called the field, and each player has 13 spots on their field to place cards in. These are called zones, and similar to games like Cardfight Vanguard, you have to adhere to the placements of these zones when playing Yu-Gi-Oh! 5 of your zones are for monsters, 5 are for spells and traps, and this one here is exclusively for field spells. The 2 spaces above your monster zones are exclusively for monsters from your extra deck. Most monsters have an attack and defense stat, as well as stars that indicate their levels. They also have 2 positions they can be in, attack or defense. Battles are something pretty common in a lot of card games, so you probably already have an idea of how that sort of thing works. If you crash into a guy, the guy with the bigger number lives, and the loser takes the difference in damage. If their attack is the same, then both of the monsters are destroyed. If you attack into a defense position monster, you either break through their wall or you take the difference in damage if you fail to break the wall. The only major difference is that in Yu-Gi-Oh! You can't normally attack a player directly unless they have an open field. Finally, if you attack a face-down monster, it flips up into defense position. To put a monster on your field, you first have to summon it. During your turn, you're allowed to summon 1 monster from your hand without having to meet any requirements in their card text. This is called a normal summon. You can either normal summon a card in face-up attack position or in face-down defense position, and the way it's performed depends on the amount of stars your monster has. If your monster has 4 or less stars, you can summon it for free. If it has 5 or 6, you must send a monster on your field to the graveyard in order to summon it. This is called a tribute summon. If your monster has 7 or more stars, the number of monsters you must sacrifice becomes 2. It is important though that you read the text on your card in case your monster can't be normal summoned or must be normal summoned through a very specific procedure. A good rule of thumb in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that you do what it says on the card. And on that note, we'll move on to special summoning. Special summoning is how you'll summon monsters 90% of the time in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! To perform a special summon, you only have to follow the instructions written on your cards. Whether that be resolving a spell or trap card's effect, or activating a monster's effect, the special summon is the result of some sort of condition that you're able to fulfill. You're also able to special summon monsters from your graveyard or directly from your main deck if a card says that you can. However, both ritual monsters and monsters from your extra deck need to first be properly summoned unless the card states otherwise. Finally, it's worth noting that special summoning is an umbrella term that encompasses a wide assortment of different summons. So when we go on to talk about stuff like pendulum summoning or synchro summoning, those are all considered special summons. If you're still confused, we'll go ahead and use an example. Incredible Ecclesia is a card which has what is known as a summoning condition. What this first line of text means is that she can be summoned without using your normal summon if your opponent controls a monster on their field. It isn't considered an effect, and cards that would activate in response to effects wouldn't be able to stop you from performing this action. Whoa, 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 whoa! What is an effect? Well, essentially, an effect is basically anything in a card's text that isn't a condition, cost, or material requirement, and they perform some sort of action. If an effect has some sort of condition or what have you, it'll be written after a colon or semicolon. Now that we understand normal and special summoning along with effects, we'll go over the different types of monsters in this game. Normal monsters are probably the least common type of monster played in the game. They lack any effects and usually are the centerpiece of a deck such as Dark Magician or Blue Eyes White Dragon. Furthermore, they often aren't played in a high quantity, and their text boxes consist of flavor text. The most common type in this game are effect monsters. Effect monsters are pretty much what they sound like. They're monsters that have effects tied to them, and these effects allow them to be played in unique ways. A subtype of this are flip monsters, which basically have a monster effect that triggers when the card is flipped face up. Another type of monster are rituals. They're basically monsters that require both a ritual spell card and monster's attribute in order to be summoned. The final type of monster you'll often see in the main deck are pendulum monsters. The simplest way I can put it is that they're monsters that can be treated like a spell card. They stay on the field when they're placed into one of these two spell or trap zones, which we call pendulum zones. And when you have two pendulum monsters in these zones, you can use them to perform a free special summon. You can view this video for additional information, but all you really need to know when playing against a pendulum deck is that they're able to set up a free special summon as part of their combos. And whenever you destroy a pendulum monster, they normally go to the extra deck instead of the graveyard so that they can be summoned again during a pendulum summon. Now that we've got the main deck out of the way, let's go over the monsters in our extra deck. The cards that you'll put in your extra deck ultimately depends on what cards you run in your main deck. This is because extra deck monsters are tied to certain strategies, and you can't make those monsters unless you meet their summoning conditions. The 4 extra deck types are fusions, synchros, XCs, and links. There are also pendulum versions of these 3 that can sometimes have effects which place them in the pendulum zones. So how do we access the cards in our extra deck? Well, it depends on the monster type, and each type has exceptions to the rule. Again, just read your cards before including them in a deck. Fusion monsters are made using spell cards to tribute monsters. Synchros are made by sending tuners and non-tuners on the field to the graveyard, whose levels add up to the level of the synchro monster. XCs are made by matching the levels of monsters in the field and overlaying the XC's monster on top of them. And links are made by sending a number of monsters in the field to the graveyard equal to the link rating on the card. What is a link rating? Well, to briefly summarize, a link monster has a number on them that it can use as a numerical variable. This means that they can either be treated as one monster or multiple monsters for a link summon. So if you have an effect monster and a link 2 on the field, you could either make a link 1 using either of those monsters, a link 2 using both of those monsters, or a link 3 using both of those monsters because the link monster can be treated as either 1 or 2 monsters. A few final notes. If an extra deck monster is summoned again from the graveyard, it can't be placed in the extra monster zone. Finally, both link monsters and pendulum monsters that are face up in your extra deck can only be summoned to either the extra monster zone or a zone that a link monster points to. So that's all the monster types. We got that? Okay, it's done. We can move on to spells now. If monsters are the bones of your deck, then spells are the muscles because they do a lot of the heavy lifting. Spells can be played from your hand without any sort of cost aside from whatever is written on the card, and they are easily the most powerful card type in this game due to this fact. After you resolve your spell card, whether or not you send it to the graveyard depends on the type of spell that it is. If it's a normal spell, quick play, or ritual spell, it goes to the graveyard unless stated otherwise. If it's a field spell, equip spell, or continuous spell, it stays on the field. There's really not a whole lot to understand with spell cards, you just have to read your cards and follow the instructions written on them. Before we move on to traps, I should probably touch on the topic of board breakers. Board breakers are powerful cards that are used to massively swing the tide of the game in a player's favor, and they're designed for going second. You're going to want to become pretty familiar with these sorts of cards as you continue to learn and grow as a player. Finally, we have trap cards. Pretty much everyone who has some knowledge about this game knows what a trap card is. You set it face down, and then you can activate it as soon as your opponent's turn ends. Whether or not you send it to the graveyard after resolution depends on what type of trap it is. However, they're also one of the slowest card types in the game since they have to wait a turn before they can be activated. It's because of this that most decks don't run traps in high quantities unless their deck is built around it. It is worth mentioning that trap decks do have some inherent strengths. They can be hard to out in some cases considering that most decks don't run heavy back row removal, but they do restrict what sort of cards you can run in your deck. So for the most part, players don't run traps in their deck unless they're running an incredibly high amount of them. What players run instead nowadays are hand traps. Hand traps consist mostly of monster cards with quick effects that activate from the hand. Yep, I lied! We're still talking about monsters! Why is there blood coming out of my mouth? For what it's worth though, there are some trap cards included in this category of cards, such as Infinite Impermanence or Evenly Matched. But the majority of hand traps do consist of monster cards that are either generic or designed specifically to support an archetype. Most of that just has to do with the oversaturation of cards in this game that negate monster effects. If a lot of these cards were spells or traps, Konami would have a much harder time balancing the game around them. Just know that we're going to want to become very familiar with hand traps, since they're a key component in building successful decks in the modern day. And that's it. No, really, that's everything. Well, not everything, but this should provide the base fundamentals so that a new player can start learning the rest as they go. With that concluded, we'll move on to our deck building section. So now that we know the rules, what goals should we have when building a deck? There really isn't a single answer, it depends on the deck you're piloting. Some decks are more linear than others, and some decks do more things during a turn than others. What's important to know is that decks fall in between multiple different types of play styles. The 6 most prominent types are aggro, midrange, control, ramp, combo, and stun. The other 2 types are burn and mill, but they don't really see any sort of competitive success in the modern day, so they'll be omitted from this video. Aggro decks try to win the game going second, and will sometimes lean into either a small ramp or stun package as a backup plan whenever they're forced to go first. Mid-range decks are pretty much as neutral as you can get in this game. They're known for having strong recovery tools, a decent grind game, and a lot of versatility. Control decks are highly interactive decks that try to control the pace of the game through multiple forms of disruption. Ramp decks are probably the closest thing we have today to a beatdown deck, and they're the hardest type of deck to define in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Since they have a lot in common with combo decks. Ramp decks prefer to go first but are fine going second, and they run plenty of extenders to try and ensure that they end on an impressive end board. This is because they're far more impacted by disruption than a mid-range or control deck. Combo decks are basically playing solitaire. They're the weakest kind of deck going second, they crumple whenever they're hit during choke points, they have next to no grind game, and their game plan mostly involves performing some long and drawn out combo in order to either shut out the opponent or win the game turn 1 using some sort of alternative win condition. Either way, they don't like letting the other person play the game since their deck doesn't have a lot of follow-up. Finally, stun decks are pretty much what they sound like. They like to drag out the game using cards like floodgates, and much like combo decks, they effectively shut down the other player's strategy. The major difference between a combo and stun deck, though, is that stun decks slow down the game by such a large amount that they have a lot more opportunities to draw cards and gain resources. I do want to mention that there is some overlap between these 6 types when it comes to most archetypes, and many decks in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Summon a lot of monsters during a turn. Because of this, using the term combo to refer to any deck that special summons multiple times during a turn just isn't very helpful when defining decks. Now you may be wondering what an archetype is. It's basically a network of cards which adhere to one or more keywords in their name, and they allow for a player to easily search and target cards in that archetype as part of their combos. What's important to take away is that most decks are built around one or more archetypes, and the play style of a deck is generally dictated by the archetypes you include in it. So let's say you just want to pick up an already existing deck. Where would you go to find those? An incredibly useful resource would be Yugioh Pro Deck, which is an online repository where players go to submit deck lists that they've made. For a beginner or even just someone wanting to learn a new archetype, this website is great because it saves you a lot of work. Yugioh Pro Deck also shows you how much those decks would cost by using figures pulled from TCG Player, which is the premier site for ordering cards online if you live in the USA. If you live in Europe, I've been told that Card Market is also pretty good. There's also Troll and Toad if both of those aren't an option for you. But even if you don't play the game physically and use either Master Duel or emulators like Yugioh Omega, this site is still an incredible resource. For most people, they tend to just call it a day there. They have a deck that works, that's more than enough for them. But what if you're wanting to either build a deck from scratch, or you're just looking to update a deck list that you found online? Either way, you're going to want to playtest and experiment with your deck list. A lot. So for the rest of this section, I want to share my deck design philosophy. I'll be building a Burning Abyss deck from scratch for this example. Burning Abyss, often referred to as BA in the Yu-Gi-Oh community, is an Xyz deck based on the all-time classic 14th century poem, Devil May Cry. Burning Abyss isn't exactly a competitive archetype in 2024, but it's good for me to use in this showcase because it's one of the few archetypes I'm really comfortable brewing decks with. The first thing I tend to do when I'm building a deck list is that I try to figure out the essential cards that need to be in your deck. This can be a bit subjective depending on what your goal is for your deck, as well as what other decks you think you're going to be playing against. In my case, I have a pretty bad habit of trying to combine archetypes. So as I'm determining what BA cards to keep and toss, I leave myself enough room for other staples and support. And keep in mind that your idea for what cards may be considered necessary may change as you develop your deck. After this, I figure out how many copies of a card are necessary, and the reason I'm doing this is so that I can make space for other tools later. Your main deck generally wants to be 40 cards in order to boost consistency. Cards that get your combos started should normally have 3 copies in your deck, and any cards that you don't want showing up in your hand should often be played at 1 copy. The goal is to just figure out what cards you want to see often in your starting hand, and what cards you don't. As I go about building my deck, I'll look around at what cards in the game are available that would work as viable targets or support. Tour Guide is a bit of a no-brainer, since it gets me to a lot of different options, and I end up putting a copy of Fiendish Rhino Warrior in there as well for some graveyard dumps. While I'm doing that, I'm looking around at what other Fiend monsters I can target with both Tour Guide and Rhino, and I end up seeing that Unchained Sharvara is a target. And this is the moment where I basically find the inspiration for this deck. Unchained is another Fiend-based archetype, and it was recently a Tier 1 deck a few months ago. In my head, I'm thinking,
human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria!
So I start shoving Unchained cards in my deck. I then fill out the rest of the deck with some hand traps and some draw cards, and now we have the first draft of our deck. The next thing I do is test what I have so far. The goal here is to see whether or not the two archetypes actually work well together in practice, or if they conflict too much with one another. My goal isn't necessarily to win with the deck yet, but just to make sure that it feels good to play. So after testing the deck and getting a feel for how it operates, I begin the arduous process of continually updating the list. Normally with my decks, the revision phase is just this never-ending process. I'll make changes to the deck and then test it to make sure my ideas work in practice. Rinse and repeat over and over. And as the deck becomes more developed, I'll stop testing in isolation and pit it up against actual players. This gives me an idea of what sort of challenges my deck has to realistically face, and it helps further strengthen the strategy of my deck. So after a lot of time and revisions, my list eventually ended on this. But your deck will probably look different. What matters is that you're exploring the available card pool and experimenting. Now, if you're just wanting to update an already existing deck, the process is pretty simple. First, you'll find a deck list that you like. Then you're going to want to identify what decks you'll most likely be playing against, and you'll look for cards to add, remove, or switch out in order to address those different matchups. And once that's done, you'll just move on to the revision phase and continue playtesting and editing your deck until it's to your liking. And on that note, this would be an excellent time to segue into our next section. I guess we should start with the immediate question. What is a format? This label can apply to homebrew formats as well, but typically when a player is talking about a format, they either mean the present day game, or they're referring to a historic era of the game with its own set of rules and legal cards. The modern day format is typically characterized by decks which do a lot in a single turn, and by games that can end as early as turn 2 depending on the deck you're piloting or playing against. Trap cards in the modern game are typically too slow to keep up with other cards in the format, and both hand traps and board breakers are vital to stop certain decks from just locking you out of the game. So what isn't considered a format? Well, a format generally has some sort of metagame. So if you're just playing Yu-Gi-Oh with a friend and you're not really preparing for some sort of tournament, then you aren't really playing any sort of format. You're just playing casual Yu-Gi-Oh. I won't be explaining what a meta is in this video since it's a common term, but something of note that I should mention here is that the present day format is always split into 2 different metas. There's the locals meta, and then there's the YCS meta. What separates the two are the stakes of the event and the amount of people participating. In the locals meta, you're more likely to run into a wide variety of archetypes, and you're not having to worry about your deck making it to top cut. This is opposed to a YCS or some other big event where you can have hundreds to even thousands of players participating, so generally a lot of players will lean into whatever deck is tier 1 in the format in order to boost their chances of winning. This means that in a regional event, anti-meta decks also have a much stronger impact due to the high saturation of tiered decks. The reason this distinction is important is because the difference between going to a locals or a YCS greatly impacts the viability of certain cards. We'll be going over two separate examples. One of them pertains to the Tier 0 Snake Eye format, and the other will go over the previous Bologna format, named after a YCS that took place in Bologna, Italy. The first example will teach you how two cards can each have a greater impact over the other depending on the meta you're competing in. And the second example will demonstrate how to identify cards which cover multiple different matchups. The first set of cards we'll be looking at is DD Crow and Soul Release. Functionally speaking, these cards are both incredibly similar. One is a hand trap that can only banish a single card on either turn, and the other is a normal spell that can banish multiple cards. The reason these cards are used in the Snake Eye matchup is because they banish cards in the graveyard that the Tier 0 deck wants to summon. So out of these two, which would you want to include in a deck if you only have room to include one of these cards? While the answer is admittedly subjective, it ultimately depends on the sort of event you're going to. If you're going to a locals where not everyone is going to be piloting the Tier 0 deck, then your best bet is probably to include DD Crow. This is because it's a hand trap that can be used to disrupt combos on your opponent's turn, so it covers other matchups besides Snake Eye. However, if you're going to a YCS during this Tier 0 format, it's recommended to bring Soul Release because it's such a blowout against Snake Eye. Now hold on, what do you mean by covering other matchups? Shouldn't I just include cards to deal with decks that I don't like? While that mentality may be fine when playing a game of casual Yu-Gi-Oh with your friends, it's otherwise a flawed approach in a competitive setting because you don't have any control over what decks you'll be pitted against. This is especially true in a more diverse format, which brings us to our second example. Prior to the release of the January 2024 ban list, Yu-Gi-Oh was in a much more well-rounded format which I started calling Bologna format. During this period, there were around 3 to 4 Tier 1 decks, and we had a lot of Tier 2 and Rogue representation as well. So when you have a format as diverse as our second example here, how do you determine what cards to run in order to counter the other decks in the room? After all, you only have so much space in your main deck, and your side deck can only hold up to 15 cards, which if you do the math, means that you can only have up to 5 different playsets of cards in your side deck. Well, the short answer is that you have to determine what cards overlap with the different decks you'll be facing. The long answer is that you'll have to also pay attention to other players' habits, which requires a lot of research in order to stay ahead of the curve. Ash Blossom, for example, is a card that will stop a lot of decks from searching, drawing, or dumping cards from the deck to the graveyard. In a format like this, Ash will cover a lot of decks. However, the usage rate of even a card as good as Ash can fluctuate depending on how people are constructing their decks at the time. This is because decks can be built to play through an Ash Blossom negate. So as the meta shifts to address common trends, you may be expected to find other cards to counter decks. Nibiru is also a good example of this. In a more diverse format like Bologna, the best time to include a card like Nibiru in your deck is when you've identified that many players aren't building their decks in such a way to where they can either negate the Nibiru or set up their end board under the 5-turn limit. So again, this requires paying attention to deck building trends. Now you may be wondering why people don't just play a bunch of floodgates to address such a diverse meta. The short answer is that some players do, but the reason why its success is so inconsistent is because with some floodgates, there's certain decks that aren't as heavily affected by them. After those two examples, you're probably thinking to yourself, that's a lot of work just to play a children's card game. Do I really have to keep up with all of that? Well, thankfully, if you're just trying to prepare yourself for locals, then I've got some good news. You can find plenty of channels that do a lot of this work for you. Yugioh is without a doubt one of the best creators for this sort of analytical content. His where to hand trap videos are excellent, and for people with limited free time, his content is invaluable. Another channel that has recently cropped up is Jesse Perez, who uses statistics to try and develop optimal deck building strategies. I don't always agree with his conclusions, but he puts in the work and is at least a channel that's worth consulting with if you're trying to improve your own deck building habits. At the very least, his content may help encourage you to reconsider the cards in your deck as you go about revising your list. Finally, I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't point out Jesse Cotton, Joshua Schmidt, and Pack. These three are among the most revered players in the modern game, and are a good starting point if you're looking for tips on how to get better at the game in general. Although if you're a crazy person like me, you could always spend countless hours digging through hundreds of different cards in the game and experiment with stuff yourself. Sometimes it doesn't bear fruit, but other times you end up shoving Fallen of Albaz into a Dogmatica Runic Synchro deck in order to get over Nichiria Beast, so your mileage may vary. And that's it really. Just do your homework, understand the type of tournament you're going to participate in, stay in the loop as to what sorts of cards and decks are good in the format you're playing in, adjust your own deck accordingly, and see if other players have any wisdom that they can share. So with that out of the way, we can finally tackle the underlying question of this video. So why is teaching modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Such a difficult task for many people, including Konami? This is probably the most pressing question relating to Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2024. And while I've shown how it can be done properly, I've personally accepted that even a tutorial as short and comprehensive as this may still not be enough for some people. Some people just aren't going to sit down and watch a 30-minute lecture, especially if they have to go back and rewatch parts of it that they may have not understood the first time. So if a 30-minute video like this is too big of an ask for someone, then what sort of problems do we have to address in order to make getting into this game a lot easier? First off, I'd greatly appreciate it if Konami revised their approach to teaching players the game. New people are coming into Yu-Gi-Oh! Still thinking that it's this meticulous game of chess, when in reality, modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is more akin to a game of King of the Hill. The two-player starter set has honestly done more harm than good when it comes to this issue, and it annoys me because there's a better way to design an onboarding product like this. I think it would actually be more beneficial if we brought back the legendary hero decks and reincorporated them as a teaching tool for new players. The products should include 2 decks designed around legacy archetypes, along with additional staples separate from those decks. It should also include a pair of paper mats and a scripted duel booklet. Not only would decks like these start new players on the right foot, but the staples and legacy support would also give a reason for returning players to buy it, and it would even provide Konami a higher-end product to compete with Magic the Gathering's commander boxes. Secondly, I don't think Konami provides enough official resources for people looking to get into this game competitively. Obviously, I think that YouTube guides and resources like Yugioh Pro Deck are a lot more extensive, but a standalone resource would be more accessible. A solution that I think would benefit everyone would be if Konami started releasing guidebooks containing deck lists from recent YCS top cuts. A product like that would go a long way to not only empower returning players, but also teach new players what sorts of different decks they can expect to run into. It would also give new players ideas for what sorts of decks they can build. Finally, I think that Konami should broadcast their higher level tournaments more frequently. The reason this is important is because for visual learners like myself, these live streams are invaluable. They show these decks in action and give an honest impression of what modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Looks like. It may not always look pretty, but it's what a new player should expect. Anyways, I rate this product 3 kits out of 10. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. There's this level in Mario 64 that has begun to stand out among the others in recent years. It isn't a particularly remarkable course. Matter of fact, it never really impressed me when I first played this game on the Wii Virtual Console and later the Nintendo DS. Through my eyes as a kid in 2009, it was nothing to me but an annoying, repetitive water level. Its aesthetic was completely nonsensical. Its background music was just the underground theme from Super Mario Bros. On the NES. The gimmick of raising and lowering the water got old fast, and the enemies as a kid ranged from piss easy to beyond frustrating with no real in-between. But as I grew into an adult, I would slowly begin to appreciate its design and challenges just as much as all the other worlds in Mario 64, even if it was far from my favorite map in the game. However, in the last year or two, something about this level started to fill me with what I could only describe as an abject feeling of vacancy. Its drabby, flooded ruins were begging to be excavated, its mysteries longing to be uncovered.
Because I didn't quit, I didn't run off, I took my ass beatings like a man, and I will be back at the top.